See you on the 22nd.
Thank you.
Thank you. She may become an assistant county attorney when this is all over. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you. They have been scrambling rapidly to try to get this information since Friday late when this was signed. So thank you guys, everybody involved, done a great job. We'll go to our presentation agenda now. Our first presentation, we'll bring in Brandon Moody. Brandon, go ahead and come forward to introduce our presenters today on seagrass trends in Charlotte Harbor.
Good morning, Commissioners. For the record, Brandon Moody, Water Quality Manager. A little over 2 weeks ago now, I wrote an article for the Charlotte Sun in which I mentioned the recently published results of aerial seagrass mapping survey conducted by the Southwest Florida Water Management District. The short version is that what that survey showed is from 2018 to 2020, portions of Charlotte Harbor saw significant declines in seagrass populations. That article was very brief in its discussion, and so we thought it would be valuable to you and to the public to hear a little bit more about those efforts, as well as other work that is currently being done to understand seagrass population dynamics in the harbor. So for that, I'd like to welcome Nicole Iadevaia, who is the Research and Outreach Manager with the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership, and Betty Staugler, who is now the NOAA Harmful Algal Bloom Liaison with the University of Florida Sea Grant Program. Congratulations on that, Betty. CHNEP has been working very closely with SwiftMud to organize, summarize, and present this information, and as a regional research and partnership entity, I think they're well suited to doing so. As for Betty, I think anyone that has even a passing interest in the aquatic health of our harbor has probably heard her name. She's been doing research and public education on various facets of the harbor for going on 25 years now, and we're thrilled to have her here. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole and Betty.
Thank you. Just click it on them.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks. Happy to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Brandon. My name is Nicole Iadevaia. I am the Research and Outreach Manager for the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership. I'll be presenting today along with Betty Staugler. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background about our partnership. We are responsible for working with local, state, and federal entities on a regional level to work on habitat and water quality protection. I will be presenting some of the data gathered by the Southwest Florida Water Management District in their recent biannual seagrass surveys. And I'll also be talking about some of the backgrounds of what's going on with a few of the other members of our partnership and what they're doing to work to protect water quality and seagrass in our areas. So I just wanted to thank all of the scientists and all of the citizens who have gone out and helped us collect this data so we can have a better understanding of what's going on in our waterways. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the value of seagrass. So ecologically, seagrasses are very valuable to local systems. They support the fishing, and they support they provide food for other marine mammals and organisms, and they also help maintain water quality. So seagrasses actually support over 70% of recreational and commercially important fish species in our area. So they actually use those areas as sort of nurseries to grow up in. Additionally, the seagrasses also stabilize the sea bottom. Just like you see the grass rhizomes on land, seagrasses hold down the sediment in the water, so they actually help with water clarity in that way. Secondly, the other way that they help improve water quality is that seagrasses actually uptake nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus in the water column and use that as fuel to grow. So they actually help clean our waters from nutrients that are in there. Now I want to kind of shift to talking about the economic value of natural resources in the CHNEP area and in Charlotte County. So recently, CHNEP actually worked with an economic group to establish the value of natural resources in our area. We looked at a lot of data across multiple sectors and did some modeling. And what turned out is that natural resources in the CHNEP area as a whole are actually valued at $13.6 billion annually. So what I have up here actually are just the data that's broken out by county. So this is Charlotte County's data for the value of the economic value of natural resources in the county. So the primary economic driver of Charlotte County is, as we all may well know, tourism. And charter fishing is a big draw to that, and also people that are coming here and spending money in different sectors for water sports. So if somebody comes here to do a dive off of Venice Beach, they're spending money in a hotel, they're spending money at the local stores, they're chartering a dive company. All of that money comes back into our local economy. So seagrasses have a value in that they're also supporting the nursery for those fish that are bringing around everybody that's coming here for that charter fishing. So seagrasses need a certain amount of nutrients, like I was talking about, nitrogen and phosphorus, to grow. They also need a certain amount of light and a certain amount of salinity. So they are a great indicator of when water quality is clean and clear. As I mentioned before, they uptake excess nutrients in the water column. And when seagrasses get to a point where they can't take up the nutrients that are actually in the water column, all of the excess nutrients, what will happen is something else will come in and grab onto those nutrients as a fuel source, and that typically tends to be algae, either phytoplankton or macroalgae that we have seen growing in our areas. They're really good at coming in quickly and spreading quickly and uptaking any nutrients that seagrasses are unable to uptake. And then what happens is they cloud the water and end up blocking out the seagrasses who actually need light for photosynthesis to grow as well. So what we're looking for is a system with balanced nutrients, essentially, not an overabundance of nutrients, but balanced nutrients, enough for seagrasses to uptake, but not so much that it shifts to a system that's more algae dominated, which is, I'll kind of talk about what we're seeing in the next few slides, but we're starting to see some of those shifts in Charlotte Harbor and in the surrounding areas right now. So as you can see from my little graphic, so a loss of seagrass is actually kind of a double whammy, because seagrasses are an indicator of clean water, but they also help create clean water. So talking about, again, the excess nutrients in our area, the map on the right is actually, so the FDEP looks at the uses for the water in our area and then evaluates whether or not water bodies are meeting standards for use in their area. So all those areas in gray are water bodies that are not meeting their current standards of use, according to FDEP. So, and again, here I just listed some of our local waterways and what's going on with impairments in those. So Charlotte Harbor, Peace River, Myakka River, and Lemon Bay are all impacted by excess nutrients, a lot of mostly nitrogen, and there's also some bacterial impacts in those waterways. And then I pulled a graphic from our CHNEP Water Atlas looking at that. So that's nitrogen levels in Lemon Bay, and you can see that red bar there. You can see where the blue line, which is actually the measurements, are continuing to exceed that threshold bar for nitrogen in our area, and that's just total nitrogen. There's a lot of different types of nitrogen and nutrients that can be uptaken, but that's just one of them as an example. So seagrasses are recognized by state, federal, and local agencies as critical habitat. So the National Estuary Programs and the water management districts collaborate with local governments to establish estuary-specific restoration and water quality goals to support seagrass recovery. So given the value of seagrass beds and the historic declines that we had seen in the 90s, what happened is the state and agencies and local governments got together and decided to work to improve water quality in a way that could be supportive of seagrasses. So now a lot of agencies and municipalities actually monitor and track the health and status of seagrasses regularly to sort of take the pulse of what's going on with water quality in our region. So monitoring is conducted in two different ways. So aerial mapping looks at spatial changes over time and locations of seagrass over time and overall acreages. That's actually done by both water management districts. So the Southwest Florida Water Management District, whose data I will be presenting today, actually covers all the way up north of Tampa down through Charlotte Harbor Estuary. So they also looked at Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay as well, and then down into Charlotte Harbor. Their district line is just south, I believe, of Pirate Harbor, And so the South Florida Water Management District actually flies aerial surveys, just the south portions of our harbor. So on the ground or in the water, monitoring, if you will, to characterize the actual species composition, the density, the complexity, and the stability of those seagrass meadows is done by a number of agencies. FDEP Aquatic Preserves, FWC, municipalities, NGOs, Sea Grant Program, Eyes on Seagrass, and those will be some of the programs that Betty's going to talk about today. I'm just going to focus on the spatial coverage, which is done by the mapping through the water management districts. And so basically here I kind of just laid out the process for gathering, interpreting, and then verifying the results from the water management districts. And as I mentioned, the Southwest Florida Water Management District looks at the northern reaches of the harbor. They also cover Lemon Bay, Charlotte Harbor Estuary, Peace and Mayaca Rivers, and they fly aerial surveys every 2 years, and then they take a year or two to process the data. And so basically we're looking at data that was gathered. So today we'll be looking at data that was gathered in very early 2020. And so after that, the next set of data will be available for 2022, but it probably won't be around until 2023 after it's gone through this really rigorous process of photo interpretation and field verification. So the South Florida Water Management District, looking at the southern portions of the harbor, covering Pine Island Sound, Matlacha Pass, they actually fly every 6 years. So the data that we have currently as far as acreage is actually from 2014. So they did just fly this last spring, and so they're anticipating that we'll have maps available by maybe late 2021 or early 2022. So again, I just wanted to direct your attention to those photos right there. So basically, the Water Management District goes out when water clarity is the best, which is in the wintertime. They work with agencies to figure out who on the ground go out every morning, drop a Secchi disc in the water to see what the water clarity is looking like. That's just a simple tool to measure water clarity, and tell them, all right, this is a great time to fly. You know, they look at cloud cover, and then they go out and they take the aerial imagery. When that's all collected, that is brought back to photo interpreters, and they have a data assessment protocol for the photo interpretation of those photos. So that one you see there, actually you can see that that's patchy seagrass. You see where those little segments are outlined in yellow? That's showing that that's patchy seagrass and not a continuous seagrass bed. And then finally, after they go through this photo interpretation process, and sort of hand in hand as well, to correct any photo interpretation, is they go out and they sample over 1,000 field sites to ensure that that's actually what they were interpreted is actually what's going on in the waterway. And they do this themselves. They contract agencies, and they also work with local municipalities to gather data. So it's a pretty large-scale effort. So I just wanted to show you a couple examples of what it looks like in the water when they map a continuous seagrass bed. And so you can see there's a couple different species on the bottom left. That's a shoal grass, and on the top right, that's a turtle grass. And so those are both mapped as continuous species. It's just shoal grass is a little bit skinnier, and the turtle grass up in the top right, that one that looks like a fettuccine noodle, is they grow a little bit thicker, a little bit more lush of seagrass beds, but those are both continuous beds and both have habitat value. So this is what a patchy seagrass bed would look like in the water, and these again are like isolated patches that are mapped in the photos. And you can see on the bottom left, that's actually seagrass that's been inundated by macroalgae. That's what you're seeing there, is macroalgae growing around the seagrass. So the Water Management District in these photos also does map attached algae. So this is one form of those larger macroalgae that I was talking about. And so those actually have a different photo signature, and those are mapped separately from the seagrasses. I will say, though, that the drift algae that you saw in the last photo, that is not mapped because of the nature of drift algae. I mean, some of it does seem to be sticking around in certain regions, but it is drift, and so it's not mapped in the process of this. All right, so here's where we get into the meat of it. So I'm going to show you a couple different maps of 2018 coverage of seagrass in Lemon Bay, then going to 2020 seagrass coverage in Lemon Bay. So you can see in the graphic on the right, you know, the actual total acreages, and then the change in acreages between 2018 and 2020. So we lost 347 acres of seagrass in Lemon Bay between 2018 and 2020. And so I'm going to flip to the next picture, and if you just look at that map on the right, you can kind of see some of those changes right there. And again, so now that's 2020 coverage for seagrasses in Lemon Bay. And One thing that I'm going to, so you can see right there, there's also that bar chart that looks at seagrass acreage over time. And for the most part, a lot of the Charlotte Harbor estuaries were different from Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay, is that we didn't see as much of the crash of seagrasses that they saw in the 1990s. This tended to be a pretty resilient system. There's a lot of aquatic preserves surrounding these seagrass areas, and so they had a little bit more resiliency when they were impacted by, say, a hurricane. So if you look at the data, look at 2004, there was, Hurricane Charlie was 2003, and you don't see it necessarily reflected in the seagrass acreage data there. But what we are seeing now is there was a little bit of an incline, and now we're getting some pretty steep decreases there. So what it's showing to us is that these seagrass beds are probably becoming less resilient when they do encounter impacts. And I just also wanted to note, so the change, and so this is actually in the red where seagrass was lost. So I'll just give you all a second to sort of look at that. I also wanted to point out in Lemon Bay that actually Lemon Bay started declining before the main Charlotte Harbor estuaries, which is another indicator of perhaps Lemon Bay not being as resilient. So you can see where seagrass was lost in 2016 to 2018. That area does not receive a ton of flushing from Stump Pass. It doesn't receive tidal flushing. And so it's got a lot of freshwater inputs. That's right where the Venice Canal comes in. That's right where Alligator Creek dumps in from freshwater flows. And Alligator Creek, I believe, is impaired for nutrients as well. Not Alligator Creek, Charlotte Harbor, Alligator Creek, Sarasota. So they lost a bunch of seagrass up in the northern portions of the bay, and then you can start to see as the rest of the bay is impacted, it's more widespread, the impacts, moving down through the bay in the 2018 to 2020 coverage loss. So moving on to Charlotte Harbor, unfortunately, I do not have any more good news in here as well. So this is, the map on the left is 2018 Charlotte Harbor coverage. And then you'll see the chart on the right is actually the coverage broken down by bay segment, by areas of the bay that are subject to different freshwater inputs, different flushing, and so they kind of all operate differently. It's the harbor is not uniform in what sort of inputs or impacts that it's receiving. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the eastern Charlotte North sector, that little square there on the right. So that is the east wall of Charlotte Harbor where we saw the most significant losses. And so just keep an eye on that, and I'm going to flip to the next map, and you can kind of see those losses really reflected in that map. And so if you look at that chart on the right, you can see that there was a 50% loss of seagrass beds in that area, which is dramatic. Those are those really lush thalassia beds. Those are the east wall is where charter fishermen take their trips to go fishing, where you're going to catch redfish, where you're going to catch snook. So this is a pretty impactful loss for that area. And those beds we would have maybe thought of as more resilient areas, receiving a little bit more tidal flushing, but as we're seeing, due to, these beds aren't reacting well to impacts. Now the beds are still there, and there's, just as we're mapping declines in seagrass, perhaps potentially when they start to recover, we'll be mapping that as well. But that's a pretty significant decline for that area. And you can see throughout Charlotte Harbor, there's a lot of losses. Mouth of Mayaca River, mouth of Peace River, Bull Bay and Turtle Bay, actually those are very thick thalassia beds as well. And so there was an overall 23% loss in Charlotte Harbor, which is pretty unprecedented for our area. And you can kind of see that in the graphic down there on the right, where it remains relatively stable since the 1980s over time in this area. And again, so that's just the losses mapped in red. And I just wanted to note the data from the Water Management District for Charlotte Harbor and Lemon Bay is still provisional. They're just doing some final QA, QC, and some final tweaks, but they don't anticipate the numbers to change too much. It might just be an acre here, an acre there. So those will be released by the Water Management District, I think, in the coming weeks. I think that they just are really wanting to make sure that they're getting this data right, and they're really going back and double-checking any areas that they're uncertain about. And so basically, Charlotte Harbor in total had 19,000 acres of seagrass, almost 20,000 acres of seagrass, and now we see we're down to about 15,000 acres of seagrass in our area. So in summary, kind of what are the takeaways? I kind of just listed here some of the bigger takeaways. These are the seagrasses that are present in our area. And so we saw between 2018 and 2020 an overall 12% loss, following that 11% loss in 2018 in Lemon Bay. And then Charlotte Harbor overall lost approximately 23% of its seagrass beds. So that's a pretty all-time low for seagrass beds in our area. So, you know, preceding this event, we had, as I pointed out on that chart, you could kind of see in like 2003 where Hurricane Charlie hit us, right? But so looking again at the chart, in 2017 is when we had Hurricane Irma, and then it was followed by a pretty prolongated red tide. And then that red tide was followed by this pretty massive macroalgae bloom that we're now working to document as well. And so you could see it received multiple stressors right in a row. And so what we're seeing, though, is that these seagrass beds, because of for whatever reason, they're getting pushed up against more hardened development. They're receiving more impacts, from freshwater flows, from nutrients entering their waterways. There's more people living here. There's probably a little bit more prop scarring. All of these things are adding up to making these seagrass beds less resilient when they are impacted by storm events, by red tide events, and these macroalgae blooms. And these macroalgae blooms are definitely symptomatic of, something that's going on with nutrients in our waterways. And so again, the source for this is the Southwest Florida Water Management District, which is a member of our partnership. And so they've been working together with a lot of other agencies within the partnership to map these seagrass beds. Unfortunately, we do not have the South Florida Water Management District most up-to-date data available, but there are people doing in-the-ground, in-the-water monitoring for those areas. And so we do have some data coming out of those areas as well, so we can kind of look at the harbor as a whole. So, as I mentioned, the cause of this decline is complex and likely involves several factors, including the red tide, increasing nutrient loads, hurricanes, rainfall patterns. So many members of the partnership, as I mentioned, we're a partnership organization with all of the local counties, cities, agencies, and the federal government are working in their own way to investigate the causes of this. And there's a lot of monitoring already occurring, but some of the new things that we're looking to do is pull together the existing data, this aerial data, pull together with some of this in the water monitoring that Betty is going to talk about, and look at it all together along with the water quality data, and then also maybe do some macroalgae monitoring to partner with the seagrass data to again, see if we can map these changes and see if we can figure out what's going on ahead of time, and look at water quality and hopefully anticipate that there are going to be impacts and mitigate for that. So we also, some of the partners are looking at watershed monitoring in the Charlotte Harbor region. We support that, looking at data to help investigate possible source concentration for nutrients entering the waterways. And then again, there's a lot of researchers looking to better characterize the relationship between nutrient seagrass and water quality as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Betty, and then I'll sort of wrap up with a few of the other new things that are going on.
Okay, do you guys want to wait till we see Betty's, or?
I had a quick comment
sure. Okay.
just on the presentation before
ahead.
we lose you.
No problem.
On the slide you just had, working to improve seagrass, there's no definitive, I guess, answer as to why it's happening. It seems like it's speculation. It's several likely factors. Mm-hmm. So we really don't know what action we need to take that we're not already taking, such as we know we're trying to reduce nutrient loading in the harbor. So we have septic to sewer program, that's big. Hurricanes, we can't do anything about that. You identified that as an issue. Exactly. Rainfall patterns, I don't know how we fix that. I mean, we follow the Swift Mud rules, and we're trying to do, on-site retention, pre-treatment before it flows into the harbor. Those rules have been around for a very long time. And then you have, and others. So I don't know what the others are. You talk about red tide. That's a naturally occurring event. Now, nutrient loading can impact red tide and algal blooms and things like that. But still, there's a lot of research being done on red tide and the impacts and how it comes and how it goes. So, I mean, I had gone through this presentation, prior to the meeting, and I was just trying to look for actionable items that we're not already doing, and I'm not sure if I'm there yet. and maybe you can help me out.
No, that's a really great point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. We actually have something a little bit later in the presentation, but basically, you're right. We cannot control hurricanes. We cannot control weather patterns and red tide bloom events, but what we can control is nutrient loading into the harbor.
Right.
And so identifying those sources, be it agricultural runoff, industrial runoff, stormwater runoff, fertilization, looking at reuse water and what type of nutrient loadings are coming from that. And then also looking at upgrading our wastewater systems to advanced wastewater treatment, so there's way less nitrogen going into the waterway from our advanced wastewater treatment systems. And then also looking at crumbling septic systems and maybe converting those to that new advanced wastewater treatment system. Those are all, those are the things that we can control and that are very large and Florida-wide problems. But
Yeah, I appreciate your data going back to 1988. It can give me much broader, holistic view. And Lemon Bay kind of struck me because I was here in the 80s. There was nothing going on in Charlotte County. I mean, our population is double what it was now, now than what it was in the 80s. It looks like our seagrass in Lemon Bay is almost where it was in 88 on acreage, according to the slide. And it seems like there's a little movement in that up and down. Is it possible that what's happening in Lemon Bay and Charlotte Harbor could be a cyclical event? That 6 years from now we may be on the trend up? Do we know that?
I mean, that's why we're continuing to monitor, because we want to make sure we're monitoring declines, but we also want to make sure we're monitoring any sort of recovery that's going on. I can't speak too specifically to what was going on in Lemon Bay in the 80s. I know that a lot of those areas historically were actually ditched and drained for agricultural canals, and then that's actually where the ICW was cut through as well. So I don't know when those impacts would have been seen in the seagrass acreage data exactly. So yeah, and to your point, yes, seagrasses in Lemon Bay and Charlotte Harbor, unlike Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay, were relatively stable, but they have become, there's a lot more of us here now. And so now we're seeing a lot more of those similar impacts. And one thing I didn't mention is that Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay also saw some pretty decent declines this past year in the data as well. We saw the most significant declines, which is, we did have a lot more red tide in this area as well, but they also have other inputs that are impacting what's going on with them. So we were all impacted by these recent weather events, but as far as nutrient loading, we have a lot more of that than we did, like you mentioned.
Yeah, but we don't know what proportionate share of the seagrass decline in Charlotte Harbor can be attributed to nutrient loading. We don't know that. How much is cyclical in nature? How much is due to human impacts? Is 40% of what's going on due to what we're doing that we can do better? The other 60% is just a naturally occurring cycle of seagrass growth, and I don't know. I mean, I'm not a scientist. That's why I'm asking the question, because when I read this, good data, but I'm looking for, again, like I said earlier, some actionable items, because as a policymaker, that's what we're here for, right? You bring us an issue, a problem, we develop a strategy or a policy to address it. And I'm getting a lot of, again, hurricanes, rainfall, things like that, which we don't have control over, but what can we do? And it's just not really clearly defined for me at this point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Deutsch.
Thank you. I have a quick question. One of the things that helped guide us and encourage us to aggressively work on opening Stump Pass with the groin system was the thing that we were told it was important and critical to do as much flushing of Lemon Bay as possible. And we've been relatively successful with that in spite of a little step backwards thanks to Hurricane Irma where we had some movement, but it's worked. And I would tend to think, because it's large and wide, that negative nutrient things would have a minimal effect on Lemon Bay. How important has the improved flushing of Lemon Bay been in its effect on what's happened with seagrass? And that's been, what, about 4 or 5 years about 4 years that's been in and completed now, I think, that it's been pretty much kept wide open.
I mean, in the maps, you can see that northern Lemon, Upper Lemon Bay operates much differently than Lower Lemon Bay, which is near the pass. And Upper Lemon Bay is where the most substantial losses were seen. And again, that's that area that is going to have receive a lot less of that flushing, that tidal flushing. And so then having those freshwater inputs from the Venice
Up
Canal.
towards Sarasota end.
Yeah, so that's like the further northern reaches, and that's where the most impacts were seen. There were, and again, I'm going to let Betty speak to this in some of her data as well. As far as the aerial mapping surveys, there was less impact seen in the areas around the pass where there is more tidal flushing.
Because they tell us that it's overall had a good environmental impact, but it's also been good for the seagrass then, I guess, as well.
Yeah, some certain seagrasses need different types of levels of salinity to survive. But I will say, and the other issue that was impactful to the seagrasses is the red tide event, and so that's coming in through those passes. So it's a little bit of everything, as you mentioned. But I'll sort of after Betty's talk, I'll circle back. I have a couple of slides touching on some action items going forward as well.
Is it fair to assume that generally flushing of the waterways is a positive, has a positive effect on the development of seagrasses?
I think, when there's
It's ocean water, from the Gulf.
right, yeah, the appropriate tidal, seagrasses are growing in and responding to whatever flushing that they're receiving now, and so those are the appropriate levels when you have these pretty stable seagrass beds, as you can see in Charlotte Harbor, because there hasn't been a lot of modification to those particular areas due to the aquatic reserves, which is wonderful. So you can see that basically one of the species, or two of the species, grow in higher salinity. That's that turtle grass that I mentioned, and then also something I didn't show you, which is manatee grass. It's a little bit more cylindrical, like a spaghetti noodle, so you got fettuccine and spaghetti. Those are the ones that are growing closer to the pass, and then the shoal grass is actually a species that it's considered a pioneer species that's growing in areas with a little bit more freshwater inputs. It doesn't need as much salinity to survive as those other ones do. And so you need both for a complex ecology, right? You need a little mix of everything. You need those pioneer species that'll hang on, and then you also need those lush beds to sort of establish that great nursery habitat.
Wow, it's like buying pasta at the supermarket. They all look pretty much alike to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Constance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to get back to, appreciate the presentation so far. I know you're not done, but I do appreciate the fact that, as Commissioner Teseo brought up, we do need sort of actionable items, and I think this comes down to what are the point sources identified for the nitrogen and the phosphorus. Because I know that there's phosphorus that's already kind of in the background. We have some issues, we've had some issues in the past year, even with some of our stormwater canals and lakes and things where we've determined there's just background phosphorus in the pit. There's nothing we could do about it. It's just there. We've had to do our own sort of flushing, additional water placed and aerations and things like that to some of those inland water bodies to try to decrease the algal blooms that are occurring in those areas there. But I think that really comes down to it. The analysis is great, and it's wonderful that it's going to be ongoing, but it's not so much how do we clean up what's there. It's we've got to stop the point sources of the nitrogen and the phosphorus from entering the environment to begin with. That's where the focus has to be. Then we could do the cleanup. Nature will do the cleanup. We've got to stop the inflow of those point sources. I think you've gone through most of what you are proposing those are. You're not able to be more specific than what you're saying. I mean, unless you know of specific agricultural developments upriver that are putting in a lot of stuff. I mean, at what point do we start monitoring, up the river to see exactly what's coming down? Because that ebbs and flows, but, there's dilutional effects, of course, but at the end of the day, we got to be able to quantify what's coming in. And is there a certain baseline that we just can't, the threshold that we can't go above at any time? Mm-hmm. I mean, those are the important questions. I don't know if you have any opinion or data on that.
I mean, I would support some watershed monitoring in this area. I think that would be really helpful to help identify nutrient sources, as you mentioned. I think that's a wonderful idea. And there are some thresholds as set by FDEP with regards to the uses for those waterways. And so, as I showed you the exceedances of that threshold for Lemon Bay, there are measurable thresholds that if we collect the data, then we can actually see how we're doing against that. And then from there, start to mitigate the impacts that we're making to the waterways. So that would be fantastic.
I don't know if you can go back to the slide that shows the 2016-2018 map loss in Lemon Bay. Yeah. So for me, I have a hard time processing why in that one localized area there's so much focused loss. There's got to be an event that occurred there. It's not, you know, if you look at all your other maps, I know there was sort of a devastating loss in Charlotte Harbor, but right there, because there's not a lot of tidal flow, some kind of devastating ecological event occurred there. And the next thing I have written down on my pad here is derelict boats. So did somebody, you know, ditch a boat in there that was full of diesel fuel and it went through and kind of killed everything? Or was there somebody that dumped something up there? Or is there something that occurred? Because that's just unusual for such a focused location to lose all the grass, essentially. Mm-hmm. So you know, for me, that just jumps out. That looks unreasonable. Just like if you showed me the eastern wall of Charlotte Harbor and it wasn't the whole wall, but it was one zone that was completely blighted. Well, something happened there. So I would look to see if you could start to look at the derelict boat data for our whole area and see if some of those, because one of the things we do now is we say, hey, if we see a boat ditching, we've got to get it out of there. Why? Well, yeah, it's a hazard for boaters, but more importantly, it's got a tank full of diesel fuel, it's got all kinds of other chemicals on board, and it's basically a Superfund site that's going down, and we got to pull it out before it kills everything in the environment. So are you correlating those types of things? Because we're talking about all this background stuff, but there are single events that occur.
Yeah, I mean, those, you know, getting the derelict boats out of the water is also really helpful to water quality. That area in particular, I had monitored that area when I was with Sarasota County at the time. That area is actually shoal grass, as I had mentioned, which is that pioneer sort of ephemeral species. And a lot of it was covered in sediment by the hurricane. And then it was, again, impacted by, you know, like, so when the red tide did reach up into that area, it didn't flush out very quickly. So those aren't those big turtle grass beds. Those are like a little bit more ephemeral species of that shoal grass. And so those are the species that are going to be, you're going to see those impacts pretty quickly.
So because of lack of flushing and because Irma had a major impact,
yes,
any other little impact on top of that, which was the red tide, basically wiped it out. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And Commissioner, if I can, the 16 to 18 side, I think we could go back and take a look at when Englewood Water District was putting sewers up in that area, because I was thinking it was during that time period they were just doing an extension up in that area, and that may have had an effect. So if we can look into that, I may not be accurate, that may not be correct information, but I do know that they had an expansion project up in that area, because I had two friends on that board. It was very contentious hearings that they went through, but that may have had an effect, because all those systems in that area are kind of like some of the systems we're dealing with. They're in the water table in some of the older houses, and all that water in that area, even those that are off the Intercoastal Waterway, that's going that direction. So I would like to know if that was the timeline, and maybe that was a positive change. But anyway, just FYI.
Thank you.
Commissioner Deutsch.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned we could be proactive by increased watershed monitoring, and I think we appreciate that. What about the subsurface aquifer? What about the subsurface waters that come into the harbor and Lemon Bay? Any comments on that?
So as far as the impacts from the hydrology and from groundwater, actually the CHNEP is conducting a hydrological modeling project right now in the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods area, which is actually just that region inland of that east wall where we saw those impacts, looking at moving water to where it's piling up artificially on the web and moving it out through some of those tidal creeks in the Yucca Pens management area, and then also that'll help prevent flooding a little bit further downstream. But there are a couple of hydrological modeling projects for that, and then supporting basically whatever the model is telling us where it needs to be restored, sort of supporting that restoration will be really helpful moving forward, because it is all related, and the hydrology and flow is just as important as anything else. Actually, EPA considers too much freshwater flow to be considers that just pollution, too much fresh water. And so, for example, the amount of fresh water that's artificially coming down the Caloosahatchee from Lake Okeechobee would be considered, not a great amount, because it's not the right amount of fresh water. And then it also is carrying a lot more nutrients. But restoring the flow to some of those tidal creeks, and then making those wetlands function better. And wetlands are, again, another way to filter nutrients out of the water. So supporting areas where there are wetlands and not developing in those areas, just so we have that protected mangrove fringe, but not developing just inland of that, where we have those marsh areas, are going to be very important for helping cleanse the water before it reaches the bay as well.
You said you guys are doing that study now
Yes.
on the underground aquifer and in that area, correct?
Yeah, we're doing groundwater monitoring in that area.
When could we expect seeing the results of that study?
So the model is created. We're about to actually talk about what future scenarios the model is going to run, and then the report from that study will come to I believe it's the 2022 January CHNEP Policy Board meeting. So that will be viewed there. We also are a member of the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative, and so we'll be meeting next week to discuss some of that. So 2022.
And will part of that study, and I'm not sure if this is possible, indicate whether that water is coming from Orlando or Tampa or Bartow or Jacksonville? Is there any way that when we get those results, we can guess or scientifically be able to have an idea where that water is flowing from?
I mean, the water that's on the piling up on the web is that's just going to look at where the water needs to be going out in that area. So you're looking at hydrological flow across the landscape and restoring that.
It's effect locally, not necessarily just where it's ending up, not where it's coming from.
Yes, yeah, we're not looking at, so I mean, the water management, and I don't want to speak on behalf of them, they do some aquifer work and things like that. That's not the CHNEP and my role. I'm not dealing with that, but and I did want to mention any of these questions. If anybody had any follow-up questions with regards to sort of like the methodology or anything like that for the Water Management District, I have those contacts as well. But that would probably be the best source to reach out to for that information.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Buddy, come up now.
Okay. I'm sorry, buddy. That's all right. Okay, good morning, Commissioners. For the record, Betty Staugler. I am a NOAA HAB liaison with Florida Sea Grant and the University of Florida. Until very recently, I was your Sea Grant Extension agent for 17 years. So today what I want to talk about is some of the in the water observations related to seagrasses and macroalgae. And I wanted to start by saying that we are really fortunate in the Charlotte Harbor area to have some really long-term data sets to look back at. So I'm going to start with the FDEP Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves. And I want to thank Mindy Brown for helping me put this information together. The Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves has been monitoring in Charlotte Harbor seagrass sites at 50 locations since the late 1990s. And this is, we talked about the aerial photography where you get this large view of what the seagrass looks like. This is actually done in the mask and snorkel and going out in the water and looking at seagrass. So you're getting a more refined look, but you're not covering as much ground. the map that I'm showing here, each of these data points is where they put down a 1 meter square, and they characterize what's in that 1 meter square. And the data point actually represents where they put the square at closest to shore, and then every 50 meters until they reach the deep edge of the bed. So, and then each color is an aggregate of all of those squares that they put down. So that's how I'm going to be showing you the data in the next slide. They've been monitoring since 1999. They go out in the late summer to early fall, so they're characterizing seagrass at its peak growth during the growing season. Again, shore to deep edge. So what you're looking at here is Upper Charlotte Harbor, the Myakka River, the Peace River segment, the west wall of Charlotte Harbor, and the east wall of Charlotte Harbor. And one of the things that this data is really good at showing, particularly as we look down into the harbor segments, is that seasonality that Nicole talked about. So Charlotte Harbor is very color dominated because of those rivers, and so when the color becomes a light attenuation for seagrass growth. So when we have heavy rain years, we tend to see less seagrass. And you can see that in 2004, 5, when we had those heavy hurricane years. 2013 was a really wet year, and then we see Hurricane Irma and the rain that it produced in 2017. And what I want to direct your attention to is the lower two graphs after Hurricane Irma. You see in the Myakka River, we see that recovery, but on the east wall of Charlotte Harbor, we don't see that recovery. So, I mean, that was one of our triggers that this was not a natural event. It was not related to rain that we were seeing these declining trends. And so this is kind of summarizing what Nicole has already mentioned, that we know that we need some level of nutrients for productivity in our estuaries. If we don't have any nutrients, we don't have any seagrass, and so we don't have any fish. But there is an optimal amount, and when we start seeing too many nutrients, then that impacts the light availability. And the first thing that happens is we start seeing epiphytes. And so epiphytes are what's growing attached to the seagrass blades. And they can compete with the light. So they're actually shading the seagrass's ability to reach the sunlight. As we continue to see nutrients, we will start to see macroalgae, both attached and drift. And eventually, if nutrients continue to flow into our estuaries, we're left with nothing but what's in the water column, or phytoplankton. And this is what we can finally pick up in a water sample. And so we can have these issues where we're seeing increasing nutrient abundance that's not getting characterized in our water sampling data because it's not in the water column, it's actually contained in the biomass of the algae. And we know that we've seen increasing abundances in macroalgae in Charlotte Harbor because of some of the data that's been collected by the FWC Fisheries Independent Monitoring Group. So they've been monitoring in Charlotte Harbor since the late 1980s, and they've been using the same 3 gear types since 1995. And the arrows on these graphs show when those gear types became annual gear types, so as opposed to just using them during certain seasons. The gear types are really designed to catch different fish species at different depths, different size classes. But you can see since about 2012, we started seeing this uptick in macroalgae in Charlotte Harbor. And I do want to thank Dave Blewett for pulling this data together. So because of the concern of macroalgae, both characterized by some of the different agency folks and the recreational users, particularly fishing guides, I put together a citizen science monitoring program in 2019 that was focused on looking at macroalgae when the literature tells us that it reaches its peak abundance, which is in the late spring. And so typically macroalgae, and we know we always have some amount of macroalgae, and some amount of macroalgae, particularly in these winter months when seagrasses are dormant and not growing, is actually good for our estuary. But in a healthy system, come warm water, or come warm weather, seagrasses start to grow, macroalgae kind of peters out typically. And so the idea of putting together the citizen science project was that we could see macroalgae during its peak abundance, and then we added another data point in July so that we could see that transition, so we would get some seasonality between macroalgae peak abundance and seagrass growing. And so what you're looking at here is 2019 in April and 2019 in July. And you can see the E1, E2, those are the black dots, and the red dots are E2. And you can see the beginning of that significant macroalgae bloom. And the middle picture is what it looked like on top of the seagrass. And by summer, where we would normally, in a healthy estuary, have our seagrasses taking over, you can see the macroalgae continue to expand all the way down into those orange dots on the east side of Charlotte Harbor. So in December of 2020, or excuse me, December of 2019, we were still getting reports from recreational anglers that this area was still experiencing a macroalgae bloom. And so in January of 2020, I went out with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and FWC, and we mapped visually the macroalgae along the east side of Charlotte Harbor. And that's what you see on this left-hand graph, is the relative abundance of macroalgae that we saw. And you can see that it was all the way around Punta Gorda. We actually think it probably extended beyond the 41 bridge, but it was getting dark, so we had to stop. And it extended all the way down to the Matlacha Bascule Bridge. In 2020, my volunteers were not able to get out because of COVID and the inability to social distance on a boat. But the aquatic preserves were able to add a couple extra survey locations in, and so on the right-hand side, you can see what an area just north of Pirate Harbor looked like in March of 2020. This is after the macroalgae was removed, and this is what the seagrass looked like. And then in December of 2020, we were hearing again from anglers that the blooms were really bad along the east side again, so we went back out in January, and that's what you see in that middle image is the extent of that macroalgae bloom. And this time we were able to get into some of the really back bay waters using a mullet skiff, and it was, you know, where we typically don't monitor seagrass, and it was really bad in those back bay areas. So this is some satellite imagery that I put together. This is Sentinel-2 from the European Space Agency. They fly, or they produce images every 5 days, and it's from December 2018, 2019, and 2020. And so you can see in 2018 what that area along the east wall of Charlotte Harbor looks like. This is just south of Alligator Creek, down to about a mile north of Pirate Harbor. And so in 2018, you can see that seagrass signature. In 2019, you can see we're losing seagrass. And in 2020, this is kind of what it looks like. Well, it does look a little better right now, but this is at the peak of the loss. So one of the questions that we've bounced around is, you know, why this has persisted so long. And one of the things that we know about nitrogen cycling in estuaries is that typically, the plants will use nitrogen, so they like this ammonium form that's readily available. And then as it's as it's becoming nutrified, there's some ion exchanges of oxygen. And then the final ion exchanges is denitrification, and that's where oxygen is being removed and the end product is nitrogen gas. So it's being removed to the atmosphere where it's no longer available. And that typically happens when you have low nutrient environments. But when you have high nutrient environments, there's another nutrient cycling process that actually competes with denitrification. And that uses nitrogen as the ion exchange. So the end product is back to that ammonium. So what you're ending up with is bioavailable nitrogen that the algae can then reuse. So it's almost like this closed loop of ammonium reduced back to ammonium where it's available again. And so we have to work through this cycle of getting this extra nitrogen out of the environment. So there is some good news. In this year's monitoring, the volunteers just completed, and I want to thank Forrest Hecker, the Sea Grant Program Assistant, for pulling this data together as the volunteers were actually submitting their data sheets. We were a little delayed in getting the monitoring complete because of the red tide that was in the upper harbor, and so we did extend into May, and so it was kind of a rush to pull this data together for you. But you can see on the left-hand side at the top is that same 2019 spring data, and on the right is the spring data from this year. And there's significantly less macroalgae that we are seeing out there this spring, and so we're hoping that the seagrass are beginning to favorably respond. We do see some pretty heavy epibiont loads, so again, the stuff that's attached to the seagrass blades, and that's, just still a sign that there's a lot of nutrients out there. So this year, so I do want to shift over to Lemon Bay. And so on the top left, what you're seeing is the aquatic preserves seagrass trends from the abundance surveys in Lemon Bay. And I think if you were to put the SwiftMud maps on, or SwiftMud bar graph on top of this, it's almost a mirror image of what their trends have shown over time. But in Lemon Bay, I think a lot of the details are in the data. You have to dig a lot deeper. And two of the things that we've noticed is that, one, we are seeing some shifts in seagrass species in Lemon Bay. And so that top right-hand graph is Serengodium. This is the manatee grass that Nicole was talking about. It has a lot of biomass. It's one of those seagrasses that creates very complex ecosystems. And it is also a salt-loving seagrass, and it is a seagrass that requires high water clarity. And you can see that after 2001, it took a nosedive, it started to recover, and then it started to lose again, and we're seeing a little bit of recovery there. We're also seeing that same kind of trend with the turtle grass, which is another high biomass seagrass species. And so part of the masking in Lemon Bay is this transition to haliduli, which is that pioneer species. And I wouldn't put one species value over another. They're all really important. However, it does show that there's changes in the estuary, so there's less light availability for these seagrass species that need high light, and that's important. So probably higher residence time, higher phytoplankton in certain areas of the estuary. We also know that we are seeing patchy losses, and so when we look at specific sites, We do see that. This is on the bottom, ICW 01. This is that northern site up in that area where we had significant seagrass loss. And you see that from 2016 to 2018, the bed really receded back. And then if you look at the individual abundances at that site, you also see a drop between 2015-16 and then again between 2017 and 18 with a little bit of recovery since then. So we do know that Lemon Bay has its share of macroalgae and epiphyte issues. These are some pictures that I took with Captain Van Hubbard, who's here today. Very concerned about seagrasses. He took me out to collect some seagrass for some analysis at the University of Florida. Different than what we see in Upper Charlotte Harbor. In Lemon Bay, we see a lot more drift algae, a lot more attached browns, and a lot more cyanobacteria. So the mats on the bottom that float to the surface in the spring. And that's what you see in that middle image. Those pictures were actually taken just north of Stump Pass, around Whidden Key. So this is some eyes on seagrass data. We were able to expand to Lemon Bay this year, so I only have 1 year's worth of data, or 1 sampling point worth of data. And you can see that we do have some macroalgae there, but it doesn't look the same as Charlotte Harbor, but we do see a lot of epiphytes in Lemon Bay, a lot of attached algae on those seagrass blades. And it is very spotty, so you really have to look at each transect individually, each site individually, and that's what I'm showing on the bottom. So this is just north of the Tom Adams Bridge, and you can see that even just along a 60-meter transect, which is 150 feet, that we have some quadrats that had almost 100% coverage of, or really heavy coverage of epibionts, and then others with very light coverage. So moving forward, there's a lot of data that we have that we can answer questions with, and a lot of projects that are coming online designed to get at more pieces of the puzzle. So, FWC, again, they've been collecting this data since 1987, and because they're characterizing the volume of macroalgae, they can, over time, look at the fish response to these episodic events of macroalgae and these regular events of macroalgae that we don't want to forget because we're so focused on these episodic events. The Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves, in addition to monitoring seagrass since 1999, they've also had a very long-term water quality monitoring program in place using trained citizen scientists since 1998. And they were recently able to acquire a grant to hire Mike Wessel from Janicki and Associates to look at those 2 data sets comprehensively and hopefully identify some hotspot areas where they can look up into the watershed. And so that's really important because they haven't had the capacity to do that up until this point. With Eyes on Seagrass, we started this year collecting sediment organic matter to get at what's happening at that sediment water interface, as well as collecting the algae samples at all of our locations for nutrient pool analysis by species. So what types of nutrients and in what forms are these macroalgae using? And I know you guys talked about being able to, point to things in the watershed to be able to reduce. That would take stable isotope analysis, which we are not doing at this point. One of the reasons we chose not to, particularly on the east wall, is because we have these nutrients that continue to cycle in the environment. And when you're doing stable isotope analysis, it's really the rate of decay that you're looking at, which makes something heavier or lighter. And because it's in the environment a long time, everything's just going to look like wastewater. and it could bias the results. So we're not going to go there. But we are doing the nutrient pool, and that will help us identify, what those flavors are for different algae species. We're also looking at that nitrogen cycling. So are we seeing these areas where the nutrients are staying in the environment? And this is some work that my colleague, Dr. Ashley Smith, is doing. She received some funding to look at the nitrogen cycling in these areas impacted by macroalgae. And there's just a whole host of other projects that are coming online to help us really figure out what is happening in our system. And I know it's tough. It's really tough because we don't have those answers. So that's what I have for you today.
Commissioner Constance?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just curious, what consumes epiphytes? Is there something that we can do with regard to oyster restoration or certain other species of critters that will help to flush and clean the water?
So epiphytes, it's all algae, really. It's just, some algae is attached, some algae drift, some algae are just tiny in the water column. Mostly it's going to be like little snails, small fish, invertebrates that are coming and picking them off of the seagrass blades. It's the phytoplankton that the bivalves are really filtering out of the water column. So we need all of the different critters in the estuary that's what makes a balanced system.
So snails and juveniles are...
Yeah, and small crabs, anything that feeds on little things.
Shrimp.
Shrimp, that too, yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? I want to thank you both. I know you have more to present, but this has been great information, good and bad, I guess, but it's still, we need to have the information, and we've tasked Brandon with trying to make sure we're pulling all this information together so we can do a better job here in the future. So thank you guys for doing this. Nicole, you want to come back up and let's talk about next steps.
All right, well, thank you, Betty, for going through that. And I also just wanted to touch on a few other matters and research initiatives that we're looking at going forward to better understand and characterize what's going on here. As Betty mentioned, some of the other research. And again, I'll also touch upon some of the ongoing research. There's, of course, the Coastal Charlotte Harbor Water Monitoring Network, which is a partnership of the local counties, cities, CHNEP, and the Water Management District to gather long-term water quality data since 2001 in the main harbor. Additionally, the CHNEP Water Atlas, what we are looking to do, this is again our public-facing data website with analytical tools, which is intended to help resource managers and the public understand water quality conditions. What we're looking to do is we're actually building Seagrass pages for the CHNEP area. And we're pulling in some of this. They're not live yet because we're waiting for the most up-to-date Water Management District, the final numbers, and then those will go live. But we're pulling together this in the water monitoring and this aerial monitoring all in one spot so we can really look at what's going on together. I mean, different agencies and municipalities have their own, they have their own work that they have to get done, and they don't oftentimes, they're collecting the data, have time to turn around and then analyze it and characterize it so we can better understand these trends. So that's what we're seeking to do on the Water Atlas. We also have some Seagrass fact sheets available if you all are interested on the CHNEP website. If you visit that, there's a link that'll click you right to those that'll talk about each of these different areas and what's going on with the seagrass in those areas and what's going on with water and inputs in those areas. So those are great for, talking to the public about what's going on with seagrass in our areas. And I think I already touched on some of the hydrological modeling projects that are hopefully coming on board soon, and support for those. And we actually also have another study working with FGCU to quantify the nutrient removal benefits of submerged aquatic vegetation or seagrasses. That project, we're actually looking at tape grass, which is more of a freshwater grass that's growing in the Caloosahatchee, but looking to quantify what exactly nutrients they're removing. And then I think eventually what the municipalities down there are looking to do is use that as sort of a credit by going in and restoring or replanting seagrass, is using that as a water quality credit for impaired waters. And then I also wanted to touch on some action items, some broader action items moving forward. So those are some of the ongoing work by members of the partnership. And again, CHNEP is a regional organization, a partnership of all of us. We appreciate that Charlotte County also sits on our policy board as well. So together, as a partnership, we've decided that these are some of the main issues that we seek to address in our strategic plan moving forward. And these are our different action items. So you can see on the left there, water quality, reducing nutrient pollution, which includes improved wastewater, stormwater, ag and industrial runoff retention and treatment, increased nutrient sampling for more assessment, TMDLs and BMAS, and improved stormwater treatment and regulation. As far as hydrological flow, flow volumes affect pollution concentration and loads. So restoring appropriate flows with hydrological restoration, restoring those wetlands as well to use as filter marshes are going to be really important moving forward as we try and strategically select areas that need to be preserved, knowing that other areas are going to be developed and help with economic growth. We need to now strategically think about where we're going to restore and preserve moving forward. And then restoring aquatic habitat, again, seagrass, shellfish, and wetlands, these all help filter the water. They need good, clean water, but they also help clean the water. And then finally, engaging with the citizenry and working together on our legislative priorities that are, again, the priorities of the entire partnership, all the counties, all the cities. We have some legislative priorities for the state level and the federal level as well, so working together to move those forward will be really important going forward, which, of course, also involves increased support for funding for wastewater improvements locally and things like that. And so I just, again, wanted to thank all of the resource managers, all the scientists, all the citizen scientists who have collected this data, and again, also your new water quality manager, Brandon. We've been really happy to work with him these last few months, and it's been a really great partnership. And again, appreciate the opportunity to present this information to the council. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Doherty?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you for the presentation. It was great. CHNEP policy meeting here a week or two ago, there was some discussion about new rules, I guess, coming out of Tallahassee relative to the quality of effluent for reuse and the nutrient levels. And I believe there's a deadline coming up, 2034, something like that. Mr. Rudy may know of something about that we're going to have to consider because you won't be allowed to discharge reuse to surface waters, and it will, unless you have advanced wastewater treatment. So just a little question, if you don't mind, Ms. Flores. I know we're doing a couple of plant expansions. I'm just curious as to just making sure that as Eastport's being expanded, Burnstore's being expanded, are designers looking at the possibility of revising the treatment method for those facilities? Again,
We just had this discussion yesterday.
have enough real estate to be able to do that as they're planning it?
Yes, and today actually at 1:30 we have a meeting with DEP to go over the preliminary engineering plans for Eastport itself. Now, as you know, right now, we're sort of on a, how can I say it? While we don't surface water discharge or have a surface water discharging permit.
Not directly.
Not directly, and that's what we're working through with DEP right now. There's a 10-year timeline right now for all plans that